one of those things that we have to understand in the West is the meaning of mass, how important that is, and the ability to keep on going no matter the attrition. And that is something that we have to consider how we're going to deal with that. That it's not enough to have just a couple of handfuls of very, very sophisticated types of weapons. You really need that ability to keep going also after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years.
This is a conversation with Anders Buch Nielsen, a military analyst at the Royal Danish Defence College and a former captain in the Royal Danish Navy. We talked about which of the two sides in the Ukraine war actually has time playing in their favor, why Russians use the so-called meat wave tactics, why do we misunderstand what would a NATO-Russia conflict look like, and how can Ukraine win this war, and many other things. Thank you to all the people on Patreon who support this podcast, because you make this possible. And I highly encourage everyone to go check out Anders' YouTube channel if you're not following him already. You can find the link in the description, because he makes really interesting videos on the war in Ukraine and other related topics. And now, enjoy the conversation. So, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Well, so I'd like to talk about the big picture of the war in Ukraine and the way forward for Ukraine to win this war. But before that, I'd like to also talk about how the war is going in all the three main domains, sea, air, and land. And obviously, since you're here, I have to take advantage of the fact that you are a former captain in the Danish Royal Navy, if I'm correct. And since just last week, Ukraine managed to sink another Russian warship, I have to ask, what do you think about the fact that the Russian Black Fleet is being taken out by a country that basically doesn't actually have a navy of its own?
Yeah, I think that's saying that the Russian Black Sea Fleet is losing to a country with no navy. It's getting a little old, if I may say so, because it's, of course, true Ukraine doesn't have a big navy, but Ukraine does have a navy, and we've seen many times in naval history that countries with small navies have been able to create a lot of problems for countries with bigger navies. And it's the whole difference between sea control and sea denial. It's a lot easier to do sea denial than it is to do sea control. And what Russia wants to do with their navy requires sea control. They want to go close to the Ukrainian coast. They want to do a blockade. Those things would require sea control of them. Whereas from a Ukrainian point of view, it's much more about sea denial. So they just have to spoil it for the Russians. And they have developed some very efficient tools for that. First, we saw the long-range anti-ship missiles, and then later on the maritime drones. And it's working very well for Ukraine, obviously. But that will not, in the end, mean that Ukraine will take over sea control in the Black Sea, and that they will be able to do those things that the Russians would like to do. So we're not going to see Ukrainian ships suddenly roaming around in the other end of the Black Sea, making a blockade of Russian harbors, for example. We're rather approaching a point where there will be a kind of mutual sea denial. And then, interestingly, I think in the beginning, especially, there was a lot of talk about the Montreux Convention and the fact that the Turkish Straits, have been closed for Russian ships, so they were unable to reinforce the Black Sea Fleet, bring new ships into the Black Sea to support the naval operations. But I think this is actually, today, it's probably the other way around. We're actually seeing, interestingly, the Russian Black Sea Fleet being almost paralyzed, unable to solve the basic tasks that they have, and then still being locked inside the Black Sea, being unable to actually bring their ships out. So that's an interesting perspective as well.
I wanted to ask if you could maybe provide some context to what's actually the importance of the naval battles or the naval warfare in the war in Ukraine, which is obviously mostly a land war.
Yeah, I think it is important. It's important in several ways. The first one is one that we don't talk so much about anymore because it was a huge success. But we have seen Ukraine being able to reestablish the grain exports. Um, and in fact, the grain exports are doing better now than they were during the grain deal period. So that, of course, is important for the world, but it's also important for Ukraine to be able to get those sort of revenue streams. So we are seeing that. And in the longer perspective, it's also a battle about the future access to Ukrainian ports, Ukraine being able to um, to exploit this also after the war and have an economy that works, maritime economy that works. So that's one part of it. But then there is also the whole aspect of, in the longer run, hitting Crimea and the battle for Crimea. The fact that the Russians are unable to have ships, for example, patrolling the sea between Odessa and Crimea means that they're not able to have ships there with their radar systems, their anti air weapons. So Crimea is much more vulnerable this way to Ukrainian drone strikes, for example, to those deep strikes against the Russian logistics. And it's also just a way to cause some very painful losses for the Russians. I mean, a ship in itself is just a very expensive, very costly, big unit. Many soldiers vulnerable at once. We just saw a Corvette. It's a small one, but it's still, I mean, it still was like 40 people that all drowned, apparently. So there are different dimensions to why the maritime war is important.
I also wonder on that note if the fact that now, as the Ukrainians have demonstrated, you can basically take out a ship with 40 people on board that allegedly the cost of the ship would be somewhere around $50 million, that you can take out a target like that using a few naval drones. I wonder if that, in your opinion, is another revolution in the character of war that we're seeing.
I think it is the whole question of drones, and that's actually in all domains, but just the fact that this technology is available and it's getting easy to make and it's cheap, that plays into the whole question of denial warfare and what this will how this is going to challenge all navies in the coming years. I think definitely these unmanned drones are just, it's right now we're seeing it with the Russians sort of at the receiving end of that, but really it's something that no country has the answers to. So we are maybe going into a time when it will be easier to do sea denial in the future. And navies will have to figure out what kind of countermeasures do we have against those things. And the thing is, this is just the beginning. Like right now, we're seeing these kind of remote control speedboat things, but pretty soon, I mean, these things have already started shooting, so they will be carrying sort of rockets or missiles on their own. They will be submerged, so they will be approaching below the surface of the water. And it's a matter of time before we will see these things. We might see it, these submersible ones already in the Black Sea, and definitely during 2024, it's likely that we will see more of that. And just how that will challenge navies is we don't know the consequences of that, but definitely we are at a point now where the big surface warships are vulnerable in a way that they weren't just a few years ago.
I think there's an interesting topic along those lines is how vulnerable is going to be the U.S. aircraft carrier fleet in this changing character of war, but that's for another discussion. But I'd like to move to the air domain, because it seems to me, as someone who's following it, but not in so much detail, that Ukrainians have been able to recently shoot down a significant number of Russian jets, and that the efficiency in that way of the Ukrainian side is getting better, and they're getting the air is getting a lot more dangerous for Russian air power. And I wonder, is that perception of mine accurate? And if it is, then why do you think, what's behind it?
It's absolutely correct. We've seen in the last couple of months, starting in December, I'd say, and then again through January, some very spectacular Ukrainian missions to take out Russian planes, and they're doing that at distances that where you normally would assume that the Russians' plane would be safe, but it just turned out it wasn't. Yeah, so, and I mean, it is interesting. I think the most likely explanation is probably some kind of application of the Patriot air defense system that the Ukrainians are using in a very offensive way, bringing it very close to the front line for these kinds of surprise attacks. There was a lot of speculation at one point that maybe the Ukrainians already have the F-16s, because I mean, it was so noteworthy that this was happening. And I mean, it might even be one of the explanations why the Russians apparently keep dropping bombs on their own territory. If what we're seeing is actually that the Russian pilots have started getting afraid of getting close to the Ukrainian border, so they do those things instead to sort of avoid completing the missions. That's again that's speculation, but it's definitely noteworthy also that the Russians apparently have these accidents all the time where they drop their weapons on their own territory. But I think that's what's happening. We're seeing Ukraine has enough air defense now that they can start using some of their most valuable assets, the Patriot system, in a very offensive way, and that is probably something that will also continue through 2024, that Ukraine will become more and more aggressive in the air war with the Patriot system, but also when they get F-16s eventually.
Well, on that note, it seems that the situation with F-16s is taking longer than initially expected, but that eventually Ukraine will, maybe in the spring, it will get quite a significant number of F-16s. And I wonder, to what extent do you think that's going to affect the situation? At some point, it seemed like maybe the F-16s could be a real game changer on the battlefield, but then some people have spoken out against it. So what do you think is going to be the real effect?
I think a word like a game changer is always difficult, because there will not be one system that changes the game entirely. But I think it's clear when we talk with Ukrainians about this that they have very high hopes attached to the F-16s, and it's very much related to the question of air defense and the capabilities that these aircraft will have in engaging in direct air-to-air battles with the Russian jets, because this is something the Ukrainians don't have right now, the capability to actually engage the Russian aircraft from the air. So the expectation is that this will make it much more dangerous to be a Russian pilot, and that it will force the Russians to keep a bigger distance to the front line with their aircraft, which in turn will give better conditions for other parts of the Ukrainian system. So it would be easier for the Ukrainians to operate on the ground. It would be easier for them to operate with helicopters and those things. And that is all something that F-16s might provide.
I think then, moving from air to land warfare, you made a video on your channel recently about the Russian meat wave, so-called meat wave tactics. And I thought that the video was really, really, really interesting. and especially your interpretation of why these tactics are being used. Could you maybe explain a little bit of why do you think we're seeing the same strategies that basically the Soviet army was using in World War II now being used in basically the same way by the Russian military in Ukraine?
Yeah, I think a part of it is probably lack of imagination, right? It's just okay. It came to mind. This is a way to do it. Let's just do it. It also about not caring too much about taking those losses, or at least accepting that those kinds of losses are part of war. So it's not that big a deal. I mean, these things happen. Um, but I think there are several sort of factors also playing in. It's also about what can you do with the types of soldiers that Russia can mobilize. Russia is having that kind of crypto mobilization. They don't really want to do a real mass mobilization because it's very clear the Russian system, Putin, they don't seem really confident about how the Russian population would react to that. So they are trying to spare the sort of ordinary Russians. So they go around recruiting people in prisons or recruiting migrant workers or who else they can find. And these are just people that don't have a lot of military training. So I mean, meat waves are it's kind of, it doesn't take a lot of training to be able to do that. So that's also something. But I think also, and this may be what you were referring to, that I think there is also a kind of signaling or a kind of message in the ruthlessness of these attacks, that it's not the big number of casualties is not necessarily seen as a bad thing from the Russian point of view. It's also something that is it shows determination, it shows commitment, it shows that you are willing to endure everything. So that there is a kind of psychological message in that as well, that about why they're doing it and what it means. So I think there are many sort of levels of why they're using these kinds of meat wave attacks, but I don't think we should necessarily see it as something that they feel is wrong or a mistake or a sign that things are going badly.
And are they actually useful from a military perspective?
Well, if you have enough people, yes, they are. I mean, you can take territory that way. Russia has demonstrated that before. That was very much the way they did with Bakhmut, for example, how they were able to take Bakhmut. They might be able to take Avdiivka the same way, which is sort of the hotspot right now. And we're probably going to see it in the Luhansk or in Kharkiv region as well, when they really, I mean, there's a lot of rumors that they really want to make a new move against Kupiansk there. So, I mean, if you have enough people, then that is a way you can do it. Then the big question is, of course, does Russia have enough people? And I'm maybe not convinced that they do, but at least not to take back everything. But they might be able to take some cities that way.
Well, that was my next question of whether Russia actually has enough people and how sustainable this strategy can be. Because, as you've mentioned, Russia wants to avoid further mobilization, but with this level of casualties, Russia, I think, must run out of all the convicts and volunteers that it can muster before they actually make some meaningful progress. I think if they were progressing towards Ukrainian territory, taking the same level of casualties as they are in Avdiivka, they'd probably run out of their entire population before they would even get close to Kiev.
Yes, I agree. I think it does not seem like a sustainable strategy that they can go on doing this for years. But then again, I mean, I've been surprised they've been able to take it as far as they have. I didn't think they would be able to to conduct a big winter offensive this year, for example, without doing another wave of mobilization. And here we are. They apparently this crypto mobilization worked better than what most people had assumed. So um, it is difficult to say when they will run out. But I will say, I think it's important that we don't assume that Russia has unlimited manpower, and this is a discussion we often get into, that, well, Russia has 3 or 4 times more people than Ukraine, so I mean, obviously they will be able to do this forever. They can mobilize many more men, but really, that's not necessarily how it works. There are these political problems with it. How are they going to react to that in the Russian population? But you also have the question of the Russian economy, which I think also is something that many people tend not to think too much about here. But Russia has a war economy right now, a war industry running already 24/7 to produce equipment for the army for continuing the war. And then it just they don't have any unemployment in Russia. Their economy is already very close to overheating. So what we are seeing is actually that if they go out and they mobilize a lot of people from the Russian society, then that may actually be a huge problem for the economy and may damage their ability to build those things that they build, the equipment that they need. So I would say, I think the potential for Russia to mobilize more manpower is maybe not as big as many people had assumed.
On that note, just a quick side note, I'd wonder what would you think about it. My personal theory is that we sometimes see Russia in the same way as we used to historically see the Soviet Union, and Russia sometimes acts as it still was the Soviet Union, but actually it's a country that has half of the population, much smaller resources, and also the Ukraine war is not a Second World War, in a sense that the willingness of the population to sacrifice themselves, I think, is probably a lot smaller.
I will say that that is correct. I think definitely Russia is much smaller than the Soviet Union. It's also important to note that the other side in this conflict, the Ukrainians, have very much the same military history as Russia does, the same kind of military tradition. So when people say, oh, the Russians have this great ability to endure in the long run, well, I think the same could be said about the Ukrainians. So definitely we are up against a different kind of it's not the Soviet Union. Russia is not the Soviet Union. And then you also touch on the thing about how big is their motivation to fight for this. I mean, I would use the terms that Clausewitz mentioned about limited and unlimited wars. You have the unlimited war is there where everything is at stake, and you have to invest everything in the war in order to win, and you have to be willing to sacrifice everything. And if you don't win this war, then that means that you will stop existing as a nation. So that would be the unlimited war. But if you have the limited war, that's more like wars of choice, right? We choose to do that. We choose to invest a certain amount of our resources in achieving the goals. And if we don't achieve those goals, well, then we can go home and things will basically be okay. I mean, and I think there is just a difference here between what are the Ukrainians fighting for, what are the Russians fighting for, and no matter how determined Putin might be, then for Russia, this is a limited war. It's a war of choice. The Russian soldiers can't go home, and then things will go on. And clearly, Putin is also making those those thoughts about how heavily can I invest in this before I run into other kinds of problems and in society.
I think that what you said are some really, really important points that I think are not being emphasized enough in the whole discussion about the war. But I think, and I want to touch more on a few of them, but before that, just talking about the Russian meat wave strategy and basically how the Russian military works, there's one thing that I've been thinking about for quite a long time. That's basically, you've mentioned how Russia is relying partially on convicts that it's recruiting from prisons, sometimes forcing them to fight. We've heard that it's forcefully recruiting migrants and trying to recruit foreign mercenaries and basically get whoever they can get, whether they actually want to fight or not. And I keep thinking, how capable can a military that's largely dependent on these people, these types of people, actually be, especially because it's such an opposite of how in the West we tend to think about modern militaries, since we tend to see them as highly motivated, highly trained, whereas what the Russians now have is basically the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, obviously they're not able to conduct very sophisticated missions, so that's also why we see these very primitive midwave kinds of things. We don't see big combined arms maneuvers, for example, from the Russians, and I don't think we will see that again in this war. We did a little in the beginning, but the forces they have today are not able to do that. And but on the other hand, they are showing that mass matters, and I think this is really what many countries in the West have to learn from this conflict as well. When we're talking a lot about what kinds of lessons can we learn from observing this war, but I think one of those things that we have to understand in the West is the meaning of mass, how important that is, and the ability to keep on going no matter the attrition, and that is something that that we have to consider how we're going to deal with that. That it's not enough to have just a couple of handfuls of very, very sophisticated types of weapons. You really need that ability to keep going also after 1 year, 2 years, 3 years.
What do you think are some of the other lessons that we should be taking from this war?
There are different things. I mean, in the military sphere, of course, like the question of mass, the question the thing that old weapons also kill. That artillery is still a thing, but also, of course, there are many lessons about drones, the role of drones in warfare, what they can do on their own, and together with other types of weapons. That artillery combined with observation drones, for example, is a new thing. The fact that our soldiers on the front line cannot rely on air superiority anymore. I don't think we should expect our side to have air superiority anymore, because the enemy will have drones. So that's definitely something. The importance of electromagnetic warfare, something that we really have to learn how to deal with that, to protect ourselves from the drones, but also to ensure that our drones will work. So those are some of the lessons, and then there's of course a lot of lessons on the more political side of things. So lessons about the willingness of Russia to use force, that they actually mean these things that they say, and that they're willing to go to war. They see war as a legitimate instrument in international politics, and we should not be complacent about that and assume that they are not going to use the same instruments against us, because, I mean, clearly they would be willing to do that if they see that it would benefit them.
I agree completely. I think moving towards more the bigger picture point of view, what do you think should be Ukraine's strategy at this point. Um, we've heard that maybe the Ukrainian strategy for this year is sort of it's called build and hold, sort of to dig in and defend and build forces for maybe another offensive in 2025. And to me, it makes a lot of sense. And I am sort of thinking, why not just maintain this strategy indefinitely? And why not just dig in and let Russia lose as much equipment and soldiers as possible until they eventually just bleed out? So I wonder if, from your perspective of someone who actually has a lot of military experience, what do you think about that? And what do you think should be Ukraine's strategy? I guess not just in 2024, but more sort of what is the way forward to eventually a victory over Russia at some point?
It's a big discussion right now because we are at a point where we just came out of the Ukrainian summer offensive, that many hopes were invested in this offensive, that Ukraine would actually be able to maybe get a quick victory. And that turned out not to work, that idea. So now I think there's a general realization that this would be the long haul. And then the big question is how to go about doing that. How long is the long haul? Who is time working for? Is it working for Russia? Is it working for Ukraine? I think there is a general realization that the conditions on the battlefield on land are very much favorable to the defensive side. The defender just has the advantages in this conflict to an even greater extent than what we've seen usually. So it's always a thing in land warfare that the conditions, the advantages are on the side of the defender in general. When you fight in land warfare, it's different on sea and in the air, but on land, the defender usually has the advantages. But the drones have turned out to be a kind of technology that makes that even bigger, because one of the few advantages that the attacker has in land warfare is the element of surprise. But the drones circulating all the time over the battlefield is that they more or less removed the whole element of surprise. So that has meant that it's really, really difficult to get any kind of offensive success. And that's been both on the Russian side and on the Ukrainian side. So I think it's clear that the conditions favor the defender. And that is why Ukraine right now is preferring to stay on the defensive. But if you want to win, then eventually you will have to go on the offensive. You're not going to win the war by just staying on the defensive. Eventually you will have to move ahead, to take some risks, to try to finish off the enemy. And then the question is, when is that going to happen? And it seems actually that is one of the big discussions right now. As we're recording this, we still have General Zaluzhny in charge of the Ukrainian army, but there's a lot of talk about him being maybe replaced by someone else. And apparently this question is exactly one of those areas where we might see some disagreement between General Zaluzhny and President Zelensky, or in the Ukrainian leadership, about how long should we prepare to stay in the defensive? When should we turn this around and go on the offensive? And that this may be one of the areas where they disagree. And then I think, of course, there's also the whole question of how much support will Ukraine get from other countries, especially the whole question about support from the United States is a big unknown right now. So that's also going to determine a lot. I mean, there is a huge difference between what Ukraine can do with and without American support. If they don't get any support from the United States in 2024, then that's going to make it a lot harder to go on the offensive. So those kinds of things also play in.
Well, you've said that on this topic that Ukraine is now in a sort of a strategic limbo, and I guess that's mostly because it can't rely on on how much support it's going to get. And I wonder how big of a problem that is for planning the larger calculations on what to do.
Well, it is a big problem. It's a big problem because it might mean that Ukraine don't have enough weapons to go on the offensive, for example. But it also means that they have to be careful about what they use if they don't know that there will be more coming. So if they look at the stockpiles they have of artillery ammunition, for example, and going on the offensive would require them to turn up the consumption like maybe 3 or 4 times. And if they don't know that there will be more supplies coming and the offensive doesn't work, then suddenly they might not have enough to go back to defensive posture. So it's these kinds of things they have to look at. And I mean, I don't know how much they have. I don't know what's in the pipeline for them from other sources. But it's definitely something that will have to play in because the United States was the biggest donor of military equipment to Ukraine. And it may be coming back, but it also may not.
Well, you've mentioned several things that I want to talk about more, but maybe I would start with the issue of the U.S. support and the military aid, because as it right now, as we're talking, I feel that unfortunately it's starting to look increasingly like the major military aid package to Ukraine might not actually even pass in the end, which would mean that the support from the United States would be probably wouldn't go down to zero maybe, but would really, really go down to a minimum. How devastating, or I don't know if that's the right word, but how devastating would how damaging would that be to Ukraine's efforts if the U.S. support would be cut off?
It's really important, and it's important in the way that they will get less. So maybe they will have to stay on the defensive, for example, not go on the offensive, as we talked about. But there may also be entire types of weapons that they will not be getting anymore. For example, the HIMARS, the Gimlers rockets, for example, that's an American system. It's really important. If Ukraine don't get them anymore, then I mean that's going to create effects on the battlefield that are difficult to predict. But it would be hard for the Europeans to replace that somehow. So I mean it will not mean that Ukraine will give up the fight. It will not mean that the war will end. It will definitely mean that the war will take longer. And it may mean that Russia will start having actual success in moving the front line. We'll see. I mean, I think I still think the conditions favor the defender so much on the front line that it's doubtful that Russia would really be able to take much advantage of it in terms of offensive success. But I mean, it will make it really hard for Ukraine to finish the war. The war will take longer, and then I think it's also devastating to just the whole security architecture of Europe. That's maybe that doesn't have so much to do with Ukraine, but there is a lot of other countries in Europe right now looking at this and really thinking about their security arrangements and how these things work and how much we can actually trust the Americans to be there. And that is something that may, of course, also have other consequences in the long run, opening new possibilities for Russia in other arenas. If this is something that really damages the cohesion in the Western Bloc.
Could Europe replace the U.S. military aid eventually?
It would be hard. Uh, I mean, Europe can do a lot. Europe can provide a lot, but we don't have the military industrial complex to replace everything. And just if we look at it, just something like artillery ammunition, for example, it's not like the Americans have. They're also struggling to deliver ammunition that Ukraine need, but they are producing a lot, and Europe is really struggling to increase the factories. If we say the Americans were delivering like half, and the Europe is delivering the other half, if Europe is really struggling to get up to that half, right, and then having to double that afterwards, I mean, it just shows how difficult it would be. And then again, there are just things here, the weapon systems that Ukraine have that the Europeans don't produce. So it will be difficult for the Europeans, but I think the Europeans would probably be able to provide enough that Ukraine don't really lose the war. But will they be able to provide enough for Ukraine to win? I mean, that's difficult.
You've mentioned that one of the major issues is also on whose side is, or which of the two sides actually has time on their side, for whom it's playing in favor of. And I think that the general narrative is that it's mainly plays in Russia's favor, and Russia is trying to outlast and outweight the West and wait until the Ukraine fatigue, quote unquote, sets in. But I'm quite skeptical of that, and I wonder, what do you think on whose side the time actually is?
I think if the West really want Ukraine to win, including the United States, and support Ukraine going forward, then time is definitely on Ukraine's side. I think we are seeing Russia at a peak right now. Military production is ramped up. It will be hard for them to really increase that a lot more in some time, maybe a year, maybe a little more than a year. They will run out of these old stockpiles of tanks and what have you from the Soviet Union. They will have to actually build new tanks, and that will mean that their production will go down, because they can't draw from these old stockpiles of weapons. And I think internally in Russia, we're also going to see more and more dissatisfaction. We're going to see more protests. We might see an economy that collapses in some way because it's overheating. So I think definitely there are things pointing in the direction that Russia will have a hard time sustaining this over time. And if they can't deliver the results that they want with the situation that we have now, then it will be really hard for them to do later. I think if the West start really ramping up production and providing these things that Ukraine needs. But my concern about it is also about cohesion in the Western alliance and what's going to happen in the presidential election in the United States. How can I think when there is so much talk right now in the West about, is there a danger that Russia might attack NATO? We have many generals coming out, politicians saying this. I think it really also is about the danger that Russia might be able to go in and try to see if they can split up the Western alliance by doing some kind of attack against the West that will mean that we will have to reduce our support for Ukraine, for example. So those kinds of things are also possible. It's really hard to predict.
I definitely want to talk about that as well, and then the wider NATO-Russia conflict and the potential. But before we get to that, I wanted to ask you about another thing you've mentioned, and that's this increasing speculations about President Zelensky possibly replacing the chief of staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, General Zaluzhny. And I wonder how big of a deal that would be for a country at war to replace the head of its armed forces, especially someone who's very, very popular, and whether that should be seen as a potential issue or whether that's just something that is a normal thing during wartime.
It is a fairly normal thing to replace the commander in chief in during war. If we look at the Second World War, for example, almost every country replaced the chief of defense at some point in that process. It is something that happens. It might also be that the person who was the right person in the beginning of a war is not necessarily the right person in a later phase. It's of course going to create some turmoil, especially because, as you say, Zaluzhny is a very popular general. There are people who will say that Zelensky is only doing this to get rid of a potential rival and those kinds of things. But I will say it's really important in a war and in the situation that Ukraine is in, that there is a good working relationship between the political leadership and the military leadership. And if they can't make that work, then I think the right thing to do would be to go out and and in the end, then that would have to mean that you would need to replace the chief of defense to get that working relationship. But there has to be a relationship of trust. There has to be a relationship of mutual loyalty between those and mutual respect for the different roles that they play in this. So, I mean, it seems like it's been going on for quite a while, and I think in the end, you have to rip off the Band-Aid and get on with it. And it's not necessarily a big tragedy if Zelensky chooses to do this, even though Zaluzhny is a very popular general.
And you've mentioned before that you think that maybe one of the rifts could be that the political leadership would like a more aggressive and maybe approach and maybe more progress, whereas the military leadership prefers more careful approach.
That seems to be one of the discussions going on, yes. I don't know if that is the entire military leadership or if that is just the view of General Zaluzhny. There might be others. Someone like General Budanov, for example, might have a more aggressive way of looking at things. So, I mean, that might be one of the things. It might also be that there is a discussion about should we mostly look at this as a military question, or is it about a whole of society kind of question? And what will the cost be? From a military point of view, it might make more sense to say, well, let's take a long multi-year defensive fight here. But if that will mean that your society will get weaker and weaker over time, then that may not be the right thing. So there are many things that you have to look at. Yeah.
I think another big issue that I'd like to talk about is what you've mentioned are the increasing speculations about the potential for a conflict between NATO and Russia. And as you've said, there's been a number of generals and heads of militaries of various countries coming up and very loudly warning about this being a possibility. And you've made a video where you take quite a different angle in looking at this and pointing out that we often have a wrong assumptions when thinking about this possibility. I wonder if you can explain this and sort of explain what's your view on this whole discussion. Thank you for listening to this conversation. If you'd like to hear the rest of it, you can find it on my Patreon. Click the link in the description or go to patreon.com/decodinggeopolitics. And if you decide to become a supporter, you get bonus content, Patreon-only episodes, and you will be able to ask questions to my future guests. And here's what you can see in the bonus part.
What's playing out right now in the world, I think it's easy to make the argument that things are actually going in Russia's direction right now. I don't think all these European generals and politicians that are warning about the potential of a Russian attack, that they are confident that the Americans will be there to help, because then they would not be warning like that. So I think that's the perspective that we're looking into here, more that Europe will have to be able to do this on their own.